So today's class, we're going to talk about Mystery Babylon. And before we jump into Revelation chapter 17 and 18, I want to kind of step back a little bit because there are a lot of difficult questions that we're gonna find ourselves asking as we jump into this passage that talks about Mystery Babylon. And really, the two questions are: when is the destruction of Mystery Babylon? When does it occur in the timeline? And what city is it? And so I thought it would be good. You can see I have the Bible app. This is the Olive Tree Bible app up. And I did a search for the word city. And I'm looking only in the book of Revelation. And I want to jump to chapter 11. The first mention of the word city is in verse 2, and it talks about the holy city. If I just click on that, it'll bring it up. So here it's saying, let's go back to verse 1. Then I was given a measuring rod like a staff, and I was told, rise and measure the temple of God and the altar of those who worship there, but do not measure the court outside the temple. Leave that out, for it is given over to the nations, and they will trample the holy city. So here's a reference to a city. It's called the Holy City for 42 months. And I will grant authority to my two witnesses, and they will prophesy for 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. Now, the idea is that the nations will trample the holy city for 42 months. And he will grant authority to the two witnesses, who will then prophesy for 1,260 days. And we understand that those 1,260 days are referring to the second half of the 7-year period. And the holy city is pretty obviously Jerusalem. What other city would be called the holy city? And you notice how it says that it will be that the temple, the court outside the temple, will be given over to the nations. And so this is going to occur for 42 months, or 1,260 days, or 3.5 years. All right, then we see the next reference to a city is a little bit later in verse 8. And it says in verse 8, their dead bodies, the dead bodies of these two witnesses, will lie in the street of the great city that symbolically is called Sodom and Egypt, where their Lord was crucified for 3.5 days. Now, Jesus was crucified in Jerusalem, and it would make sense. The holy city seems to be called the great city. And they're there for 42 months. They die for 3.5 days. Some of the people, tribes, and languages and nations will gaze at their dead bodies and refuse to let them be placed in a tomb. And those who dwell on the earth will rejoice over them. That's always those who dwell on the earth is a reference to non-believers. Will rejoice over them and make merry and exchange presents, because these two prophets have been a torment to those who dwell on the earth. But after 3.5 days, a breath of life from God entered them, and they stood up on their feet, and great fear fell on those who saw them. They heard a loud voice from heaven saying to them, come up here. And they went up to heaven in a cloud, and their enemies watched them. And then in verse 13, and at that hour there was a great earthquake, and 1/10 of the city fell. Seems to again be referring to Jerusalem. There's a great earthquake that happens in Jerusalem, and 1/10 of the city falls. Now notice it falls, at least 1/10 of the city falls because of this great earthquake. And 7,000 people were killed in the earthquake, and the rest were terrified and gave glory to the God of heaven. The second woe has passed. Behold, the third woe is soon to come. Now that second woe was referring to the fifth trumpet. Or the sixth trumpet, I'm sorry. And so that puts us, we know that we're right near the end of the 7-year period. That's why we put those two witnesses, their death occurs right at the end, it would appear, as of the 7-year period. All right, so now if we let's go back and keep looking for the word city. And we see the next place where it talks about a city is in chapter 14, verse 20. And it says right here, now if we go back, let's get a little bit of context. Chapter 14 started with talking about the 144,000. It talks about them being on Mount Zion. It's not clear when that's occurring. Is that occurring at the end of the 7-year period, or is that occurring as the Jews are fleeing through the wilderness? Or is this when the 144,000 are sealed? But it wouldn't make sense that the 144,000 are sealed on Mount Zion. So it's kind of it's difficult to know exactly what this passage means, but it's talking about the 144,000 who are redeemed for the earth, their first fruits, and they follow the Lamb, which would be Jesus, everywhere he goes. Then we get the messages from 3 angels. The first one is preaching the eternal gospel, proclaiming to those who dwell on the earth, every nation, tribe, language, and people, fear God, give him glory, because the hour of his judgment has come, and worship him who made heavens and earth, and the sea and the springs of water. This seems to be right when either just before the day of the Lord begins, or could very well be the final part of the day of the Lord at the Battle of Armageddon. But let's look at some more of the context. It says, another angel, a second followed, saying, fallen is Babylon the Great, she who made all the nations drink the wine of the passion of her sexual immorality. So this angel is saying, fallen is Babylon the Great. Now this is really going to be the focus of today's study. Babylon the Great, what city, is that the same city? And another angel, a third of them, said, if anyone worships the beast and its image and receives a mark on his forehead or his hand, he will drink the wine of God's wrath, poured full strength into the cup of his anger. And he will be tormented with fire and sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and the presence of the Lamb. The smoke of the torment goes up forever and ever, and they have no rest day or night, these worshipers of the beast and its image, and whoever receives the mark of his name. And then we get this kind of interesting passage. Here is the call of the endurance of the saints, those who keep the commandments of God and their faith in Jesus. And I heard a voice from heaven saying, write this, blessed are the dead, these are the martyrs, who die in the Lord from now on. Blessed indeed, says the Spirit, that they may rest from their labors, for their deeds follow them. And so here we have this interesting reference to Babylon the Great has fallen. Not clear that, remember we just read that Jerusalem fell because there was an earthquake. A tenth of the city fell and 7,000 people die. Is this fallen the same, this Babylon that falls, that's being described here, is it the same as Jerusalem that falls, at least a tenth of it falls because of an earthquake? And what's also interesting is if we sort of look at this context, it's talking about 144,000, not clear where in the timeline it's referencing this. The eternal gospel is being preached. Somehow Babylon, either it's prophesying that Babylon will fall, or Babylon has already fallen or is about to fall. And then we get a warning, don't worship the beast. Well, we know that the worshiping of the beast happens right at the midpoint, the abomination of desolation. The beast is the Antichrist. He sets up an image of himself in the temple and demands to be worshiped. You remember we learned the false prophet is trying to enforce that, if anyone won't worship the beast, he's gonna cut their heads off. He's the enforcer of this new religion that requires everyone to worship this beast. So this seems to be a warning that covers the entire second 3.5-year period. And at the same time, it talks about saints who keep the commandments of God and their faith in Jesus. And they're told, you're blessed. Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. And from this passage, it's really, really hard to tell where are we. It seems to be kind of all over the place. It's hard to get a timeline. Get the timeline straight, because it seems to be talking to different groups in that second 3.5-year period. And it's kind of interesting because then what follows, this kind of encouragement to the saints, who it says, hang on there and blessed are you if you die. And then you remember we talked about the harvest, and the harvest seemed to have two phases to it. One was this reaping that we understood to be the rapture. And then the second one seems to be the sickle that's described as gathering the grapes of harvest. It's the great winepress of the wrath of God. And it would seem to be describing the battle of Armageddon. And then in verse 20, it says, the winepress was trodden outside the city. What city are we talking about? Seems to be Jerusalem. And the blood flowed from the winepress as high as a horse's bridle for 1,600 stadia. And so we have the city again, another city here. Is that city the same as this mystery Babylon that is going to fall? Babylon the Great. And so, all right. If it's this city right here would most likely be Armageddon. And that would be at the end of the 7-year period. But it's hard to pin down what is this mystery Babylon that's also going to fall. Is it the same city? All right, so we go back. I think those are, there's one more passage that I want to look at. This is the 7th bowl. Now, if you remember, in the 6th bowl, all the armies have gathered and they assembled them at the place that in Hebrew is called Armageddon. And then the 7th bowl is opened. The 7th is poured out. The 7th angel poured out his bowl into the air, and a loud voice came out of the temple from the throne saying, "It is done." There were flashes of lightning, rumblings, peals of thunder, and a great earthquake. Again, remember, there was an earthquake that destroyed at least a tenth of Jerusalem. A great earthquake, such as there had never been since man was on the earth. So great was that earthquake. The great city, what city is it talking about, was split into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations fell. So here's more cities. Cities of the nations fell. And God remembered Babylon the Great to make her drain the cup of the wine of the fury of his wrath. And every island fled away, and no mountain were to be found, and great hailstones, about 100 pounds, each fell from heaven on people, and they cursed God for the plague of the hail, because the plague was so severe. And you remember last week we asked the question, who is getting saved? Is anybody getting saved during the day of the Lord? In every passage that we looked at, it kept saying, nobody's saved, nobody repents, everybody's cursing God. Doesn't seem like anybody's getting saved. But go back here, look at this back in verse 19. The great city was split into 3 parts. That's probably talking about Jerusalem. And the cities of the nations fell, and God remembered Babylon the Great to make her drain the cup of the wine of the fury of his wrath. And the idea here is that perhaps Babylon the Great is not the same as the great city, which we would think of as Jerusalem. Even though we're going to find out that Babylon the Great is in a couple of places also called the great city. And is there one great city, or is it just saying some great city? There's maybe several great cities. Babylon's a great city, maybe, and so is Jerusalem. But they're great, obviously, in very different ways. So with all of this, I hope, I think all this is probably doing is confusing you, but I want to make sure you understand this. And this is why I struggle with this, because I'm trying to do my best to pinpoint what city is this Babylon and when is it destroyed. So now we get to chapter 17. And I'm going to move that aside, and we'll use the bigger font here. All right, so chapter 17 in the book of Revelation. Then one of the seven angels who had the 7 bowls came and said to me, "Come, I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute, who is seated on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality, and with the wine of whose sexual immorality the dwellers on earth have become drunk." Notice this big emphasis on sexual immorality. "And he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names, and it had 7 heads and 10 horns. Now, this beast with the 7 heads and 10 horns, we know that's the beast, the Antichrist. And we know that that beast is the Antichrist, and the 7 heads, we'll read a little bit more. It'll say a little bit more in just a minute. But the 10 horns are representing 10 nations that have given their authority to this Antichrist, to the beast. And I personally believe that this is representing an Islamic caliphate. It's representing 10 nations that have come together under this common ruler, the Antichrist, forming an Islamic caliphate. Could be wrong on that, but that seems to make the most sense, and maybe I'll explain a little bit more why I think that's what it is in a little bit. Now, the woman is not the beast, but the woman is sitting on the beast. And it says, the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and jewels and pearls, holding in her hand the golden cup full of abominations and the impurities of her sexual immorality. And on her forehead was written a name of mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of prostitutes and of earth's abominations. And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints, the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. So, first of all, this is telling us that not only is this Babylon involved with sexual immorality, but she appears to be wealthy, rich, adorned in purple and scarlet with gold, jewels, pearls, and so on. But not only that, this harlot, this woman, Babylon the Great, has the blood of the saints on her hands. In some way, she is responsible for these martyrs. Now, we also know that the beast is obviously responsible for the martyrs too. Now, when I saw her, I marveled greatly, but the angel said to me, "Why do you marvel? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast with 7 heads and 10 horns that carries her." Again, notice this woman that represents Mystery Babylon, the harlot, is not the same as this beast. She's sitting on the beast. The beast is carrying her. The beast that you saw was and is not and is about to rise from the bottomless pit and go to destruction. Now, it's kind of interesting because we read, remember that the Antichrist, described as a beast, was he was slain with a sword and somehow came back to life, and the world marveled at him. But on the other hand, we also read about another beast that rose from the bottomless pit, the destroyer. And it's like another beast, but somehow it's part of the same beast. And so it's a little bit hard to pinpoint exactly what this is, but I think most people look at the beast that was what represents the prior kingdoms that were prophesied by Daniel. And then he died, and then he is to come is this one that comes out of the bottomless pit. And they're all going to destruction. And the dwellers on earth, whose names have not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, will marvel to see the beast, because it was, in other words, it had died, and is not, and is to come. And you remember that we read how the world marveled, because they were saying, I think it was in Revelation 13, who can overcome the beast? I mean, he died and he comes back to life. There's nobody like him. So verse 9, this calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. So this woman is seated on this beast with 7 heads. Now, some people would say, oh, this has definitely got to be a reference to the Catholic Church, because the Catholic Church, the Vatican is sort of the city on 7 hills, or Rome is, on seven hills. But that doesn't work so well, because the word for mountain is not the same as hill. And not only that, these 7 heads or mountains are sometimes referred to as kingdoms. And it would appear that these 7 heads are representing kingdoms. And so trying to pin this down on the Catholic Church, a lot of people kind of try to do that. And it's interesting, you go online and the Catholic Church fights back and says, that's not us. And, there's a little bit of a controversy here, but I kind of agree with the Catholic Church. I don't believe this is talking about the Catholic Church. This harlot, this woman, is sitting on this beast with the 7 heads. And I don't believe that the Catholic Church is the beast. I don't believe the Antichrist comes out of the Catholic Church. I really believe that this beast is describing a resurrected Muslim Islamic caliphate. And the woman is seated on that beast. They are also 7 kings. See, we just read those 7 horns are 7 kings, 5 of whom have fallen. 1 is, the other has not yet come. And when he does come, he must remain only a little while. I believe this is the resurrected Antichrist. As for the beast that was and is not, it is an 8th, but it belongs to the 7. And this could be, and it goes to destruction. This could be talking about this beast that comes out of the pit. And it's very likely that there's an overlap of the Antichrist and this destroyer, this beast that comes out of the pit, and they work together. It's kind of it's a difficult to get it perfectly straight on this. It's a little bit vague, but that's what I believe it's talking about. And the 10 horns that you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received royal power, but they are to receive authority as kings for 1 hour together with the beast. I believe this is talking about that final 3.5-year period. These are of one mind, and they hand over their power and authority to the beast. Actually, I should back up. It could be that they come together even before them. They could be longer. It could be at the beginning of the 7-year period. But they join with this Antichrist. And it's not until the midpoint where the Antichrist is actually revealed for who he is. And it's at that point you remember that the Antichrist is indwelt by Satan, who was kicked out of heaven. It says, these are of one mind, and they hand over their power and authority to the beast. That's these 10 nations. They will make war on the Lamb, and the Lamb will conquer them. I believe this is talking about the Battle of Armageddon. For he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and those with him are called and chosen and faithful. Okay, now, remember that we were told that this beast will make war against the saints and on God's people. And he's going to basically have authority over the world for 42 months. So, here, when it's talking about that these nations will make war on the Lamb and the Lamb will conquer them, the Lamb conquers them at the very end of the 7-year period during the Battle of Armageddon. So this seems to be talking about the Battle of Armageddon. And the angel said to me, the waters that you saw where the prostitute is seated are peoples and multitudes and nations and languages. So this prostitute is where she is seated. This water represents people, multitudes and nations and languages. In other words, the whole world. And the 10 horns that you saw, they and the beast will hate the prostitute. Now, this is something that it's easy to miss, because the beast and this prostitute, the harlot, the woman sitting on the beast, they're both bad, but they actually hate each other. They're not on the same side. So keep that in mind. They will make her desolate and naked and devour her flesh and burn her up with fire. So the beast is going to make her desolate, naked, and devour her flesh and burn her up with fire. For God has put it into their hearts to carry out his purpose by being of one mind and handing over the royal power to the beast until the words of God are fulfilled. And the woman that you saw is the great city that has dominion over the kings of the earth. Now, notice that this woman is the great city. That great city seems to be Babylon, the mystery Babylon. And it has dominion over the kings of the earth. All right, so let's take a step back. What have we learned? There's this woman described as a harlot. She's rich. She's deep into sexual immorality. This woman represents a city, and this city has authority, has dominion over the kings of the earth. Seems to maybe be ruling the earth in some way, or have strong influence over the kings of the earth, not just anybody, but the rulers of the nations. And this city, and the beast hates this city. The beast representing the Antichrist and the 10 nations that follow him. And if those nations are representing the Islamic, kind of radical Islamic caliphate, what cities, you could ask yourself, do they hate in the earth, on the earth? Well, do they hate Jerusalem? Well, wait a minute. We know at the midpoint, they attacked Jerusalem and have conquered it, and they've set up an image of the beast in the temple. Why would they destroy Jerusalem if it's now become sort of their, big city where everybody's supposed to worship them? And why would they do this to Jerusalem? If it's the Islamic world, don't they go to Mecca to worship? Isn't that really the main place where worship occurs? So one of the theories is that Mystery Babylon is Mecca in Saudi Arabia. And one of the theories is that this Islamic nation is headed by Iran. And who does Iran hate? They hate Saudi Arabia. And they're very close to war. Right now, they hate each other. And one theory is that the Antichrist actually destroys Mecca and makes Jerusalem their sort of the center of worship, where the Antichrist has his image. And if that theory is correct, Mecca would be Mystery Babylon. But there's a little bit of a problem with Mecca, as we're going to see. Is it really a rich city if you look at all the cities in the world? And would all the 10 nations that, even if they're aligned with the Antichrist who comes out of Iran, would they all be in favor of attacking Mecca, which is currently their, the center of their worship? And we're going to find out in just a little bit that that whatever city is Mystery Babylon, they seem to be on a harbor, and they're the center of trade and commerce. And I don't see Mecca as the center of trade and commerce. And Mecca certainly isn't on a, it isn't a harbor where ships can come in and load and unload their cargo. And so Mecca is interesting, but I don't think it's Mecca. And I don't really think it's Jerusalem, because as we find out here, Mystery Babylon is burnt up with fire, whereas Jerusalem had an earthquake, fell when God had an earthquake. And I don't necessarily believe that this Mystery Babylon is Jerusalem. I don't believe it's the Catholic Church, even though, the one big thing is the Catholic Church is, the city, Rome and the Vatican, on 7 mountains. That seems to be the best argument for it being the Catholic Church. And a lot of Protestants would tell you that the Catholic Church has, over the years has gone after and killed Protestant Christians. But I look at the Catholic Church today and I don't really see that. I'm not a Catholic, but I don't see the Pope as the Antichrist and the Catholic Church, somehow having that sort of authority over the nations. Even though they have influence, I don't see that. Some people have speculated that Babylon is actually Babylon, which would be located in Iraq. And what was kind of interesting, back in the Gulf War, Saddam Hussein from Iraq was, made his move to, he attacked Kuwait, and everybody was worried that he would spread. But Saddam Hussein was defeated. And, Saddam Hussein thought of himself as the sort of resurrected Nebuchadnezzar. king of Babylon, and I think he had plans of building up Babylon into another great city. And people had speculated, is it possible that this mystery Babylon could be actual Babylon? But I don't think it's that either. And so let's just take a step back. You all remember the Tower of Babel. What had happened was the people had congregated and they were building this obelisk, this tower. And God looked down and he says, oh my gosh, if, he probably said, oh my God, because he was God, except I don't know how he would phrase that expression. But he looked down and he said, if we let these people do this, there's nothing, all evil is going to happen. We cannot let the nations sort of come together under a one kind of a central government. I need to scatter them. And so he scattered all the nations at Babylon. Kind of interesting where Babylon seems to be the center of, at least the beginnings of, not only false religion, but the idea of this global government. And we can see that the Antichrist, really empowered by Satan, has been trying to put together this one world government. He's conquering the world, and that's the whole thing, right? Satan is known as the ruler of this world. He wants it all consolidated under his control, under a central government. And so if Babylon is somehow, you remember, it has Babylon, this mystery Babylon has dominion over the kings of the earth. What city in the world has dominion over the kings of the earth? And the answer, there is really only one city. And right now, it would, if it was to happen today, it would be New York and the UN. And if you step back, remember, the beast hates this woman, and the woman represents a city. And they went and they attacked New York, the Trade Center. If it is a Muslim, an Islamic caliphate that's declaring war on the world, of course they hate Israel, but America is the great Satan, and they would go after America, and their number one target would be New York City. And it's interesting. New York City is on a harbor. It has Wall Street. It's the center of trade, really, in the world. If you look at the markets and Wall Street, the UN has dominion over the kings of the earth. And, if you were to ask any Israeli, so what do you think of the UN in terms of their policies with Israel? And they would say, oh, the UN has blood on their hands. And the UN is certainly not a friend to Christians either. And so let's keep reading. And, you could ask yourself as we go through these verses, could it be that this mystery Babylon is New York? And could it be talking about, when it talks about burning up with fire, right? Devour her flesh and burn her up with fire. They tried it, if it is New York, they tried at 9/11, by crashing airplanes, big jets into the Trade Center, the Twin Trade Center buildings. But suppose that this Antichrist and the beast obtained weapons of mass destruction, like a nuclear bomb. It would just blow up in an instant, and people would look at that and they'd just be shocked that this great city was destroyed, and it would be burnt up with fire, the entire city. So let's read and see what if any of this makes sense. And you can speculate. Is this the real Babylon? Is this New York City? Is it Jerusalem? Is it Mecca? Or maybe it's just some other city that we don't even know yet. Because it's so far out into the future, it could be some other city. Who knows? But let's read chapter 18 now. After this, I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was made bright with his glory. And he called out with a mighty voice, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great." Sounds familiar. We just read that before. She has become a dwelling place for demons, a haunt for every unclean spirit, a haunt for every unclean bird, a haunt for every unclean and detestable beast. For all the nations have drunk the wine of the passion of her sexual immorality. Take a step back. Would you describe New York as a place where sexual immorality, is prevalent? And would you describe that as the Vatican? I mean, I suppose somebody might say with all the gay, the pedophile kind of stuff that was going on in the Catholic Church, but I don't think that's really what it's talking about. I don't think you would describe Jerusalem as being dominated by sexual immorality. And I don't think you would describe Mecca like that. But you definitely would describe New York in that way. It says, and the kings of the earth have committed immorality with her, and the merchants of the earth have grown rich from the power of her luxurious living. Obviously, the cost of living in New York is very high. With Wall Street and all of that, a lot of people have grown rich. The merchants of the earth have grown rich. Then I heard another voice from heaven saying, come out of her, my people, lest you take part in her sins, lest you share in her plagues. Here's a call for God's people to come out of the city. And you know that New York City has 1.1 million Jews. There are more, and there's 1.5 Jews living in the Mecca area, the larger metropolitan kind of region is more like 1.5 million Jews. And could this be, when he says my people, could he be referring to the Jews? Saying, come out of her. And, I remember after 9/11 thinking to myself, the last place I would live is New York City, because they're probably the number one target for a nuclear bomb coming from, Islamic terrorists. And then it goes on in verse 5, for her sins are heaped high as heaven, and God remembered her iniquities. Pay her back as she herself has paid back others, and repay her double for her deeds. Mix a double portion for her in the cup she mixed, as she glorified herself and lived in luxury. So give her a like measure of torment and mourning, since in her heart she says, I sit as a queen, I'm no widow, and mourning I shall never see. For this reason, her plagues will come in a single day, death and mourning and famine, and she will be burned up with fire. Again, burned up with fire. And, okay, is this a little fire, or is this the whole city? It seems to be describing the whole city burnt up with fire. For mighty is the Lord God who has judged her. Now remember, we read that Jerusalem had a great earthquake, and a tenth of the city fell and 7,000 people died. But we read about this mystery Babylon city, that the beast destroys her with fire. And it seems to be, as far as I can tell, destroying the entire city. And the only thing that makes sense to me is this sounds to me like a nuclear bomb blowing up in New York, or at least whatever city this mystery Babylon is. And then verse 9, and the kings of the earth who committed sexual immorality and lived in luxury with her will weep and wail over her when they see the smoke of her burning. I read that the smoke of her burning could be a nuclear, the explosion, the mushroom cloud. And they will stand far off in fear of her torment and say, alas, alas, you great city, you mighty city Babylon, for in a single hour your judgment has come. Notice it says in a single hour, whereas right here, back in verse 8, it talked about a single day. It seems like whatever happens, it happens quick, like an explosion. And then verse 11, and the merchants of the earth weep and mourn for her, since no one buys their cargo anymore. Cargo of gold, silver, jewels, pearls, fine linen, purple cloth, silk, scarlet cloth, all kinds of scented wood, and all kinds of articles of ivory, all kinds of articles of costly wood, bronze, iron, and marble, cinnamon, spice, incense, myrrh, frankincense, wine, oil, fine flour, wheat, cattle, sheep, horses, chariots, slaves, even slaves, that is human souls, involved in slave trade. The merchants are mourning because nobody buys their goods anymore. Wall Street is destroyed. The market is gone. It says the fruit and it seems to be describing everything, back at least when the book of Revelation was written, you could imagine. It seems to be talking about all kinds of commerce. Verse 14, the fruit for which your soul longed has gone from you, and all your delicacies and your splendors are lost to you, never to be found again. Verse 15, the merchants of these wares who gained wealth from her will stand far off in fear of her torment, weeping and mourning aloud. Alas, alas, for the great city that was clothed in fine linen, in purple and scarlet, adorned with gold, with jewels, and with pearls. For in a single hour, all this wealth has been laid waste. Again, it sounds like a nuclear bomb blowing up the whole city. And then we get this. And all the shipmasters and seafaring men, sailors, and all whose trade is on the sea stood far off and cried out as they saw the smoke of her burning. What city was like the great city? And they threw dust on their heads and they wept and mourned, crying out. Now, back here, the seafaring men and sailors, they stood far off. Now, I'm assuming that they're on their ships. They would be looking at this great city because it's on a harbor, and they were able to see this city, as it says, they saw the smoke of her burning. So it would seem that this city, that you would at least have to be able to see it's burning. Perhaps it's, if it's a nuclear bomb, the mushroom cloud, you would be able to see it from sea. And it kind of is telling us that this city probably is on a harbor or has a harbor so that the ships can see it. What city was like the great city? And they threw dust on their heads as they wept and mourned, crying out, alas, alas, for the great city where all who had ships at sea grew rich by her wealth. Again, a reference seeming to be that these ships maybe go there to their harbor. That shipping maybe is occurring at New York. For in a single hour she has been laid waste. Rejoice over her, O heaven, and you saints and apostles and prophets, for God has given judgment for you against her. Then a mighty angel took up a stone like a great millstone and threw it into the sea, saying, so will Babylon the great city be thrown down with violence and will be found no more. And the sound of harpists and musicians, of flute players and trumpeters will be heard in you no more. Now it's actually telling us it's a place where music was thriving. And a craftsman of any craft will be found in you no more. The sound of the mill will be heard in you no more. The light of a lamp will shine in you no more. And the voice of bridegroom and bride will be heard in you no more. For your merchants were the great ones of the earth, and all nations were deceived by your sorcery. And in her was found the blood of prophets and saints and of all who have been slain on the earth. And again, you sort of look back at the UN and all of the junk that they've been involved in. And you can only see it getting worse as, we look at our world right now, moving more and more towards a global kind of an organization, the UN trying to take more and more power. And you could easily see, if we just step back, the UN works together with the Islamic nations, headed up by this Antichrist who nobody knows is the Antichrist, and they make a covenant with Israel, and that starts the 7-year peace, that peace plan, the 7-year period. And so there's the sense of the UN working with the Islamic nations. They're in some sort of collaboration doing this, but very soon afterwards, the Islamic nations begin to rebel. And right at the midpoint, they attack Jerusalem, which was their plan all along. And now they hate the UN. The UN's like, hey, what are you doing? We made a treaty, and I don't believe the Islamic world is happy to get along with the rest of the world, especially the Western world. They'll use the UN for their own purposes, but at some point they're going to go to war. We look at our world right now, and we see the most crazy of alliances forming. We see the Islamic movement, like the Muslim Brotherhood, aligning with Marxists and anarchists, aligning with, and you see, these all of these radical social justice groups, Black Lives Matters groups, all of these really radical groups aligning with the radical Islamic community, and suddenly they're against Israel. They want to boycott Israel. They chant along. You know, if you watch some of these marches occurring, they're chanting for the destruction of Israel. Why does Black Lives Matters care about destroying Israel? But they're doing it. And we see this, the craziest of alliances forming. And there's one reason why they're forming. They want to bring down Western civilization, and Western civilization is really dominated by the Judeo-Christian worldview. And so it's no wonder the enemies of both the beast and of this harlot are Jews and Christians. And when this passage tells, he says, my people, get out of this city. I believe that that's actually imploring Jews, get out of New York, because it's going to be destroyed. It's going to be attacked, and don't participate in all of the junk that comes out of New York. All right, so I could be completely wrong. You know, perhaps it's some other city, but New York really seems to fit in my mind. It's not a perfect fit, but it's a pretty good fit. And I don't know if that's what it is or not, but we should be paying attention. We definitely see the Antichrist pushing, as well as, you know, this woman, which seems to be also representing Babylon, which has authority over all the nations. We see these two groups wanting to have authority over the nations. And this is, I believe, the battle over the world between the forces of evil. A day of reckoning will come. These alliances that we see today, you know, between the Muslim Brotherhood and other Marxist radical kind of groups, that is not the reason why they're coming together is because they hate basically God and God's people, Jews and Christians. And we should be paying attention to this and definitely not be part of it. So let's end with a quick word of prayer, and then we'll open it up for questions. Lord, I thank you for your word. It's kind of confusing, but you're giving us all the warnings, at least some of the hints. Perhaps we're not quite there yet, and so the clues haven't all fallen in place, but help us to understand at least what's going on in our world right now, and help us to stay separate from that, to stay pure and clean, and not fall down these paths that suck us, that seem to be sucking the whole world into this darkness, this craziness that is leading to all kinds of violence and just craziness, Lord. And so we ask also that you keep us strong, help us to not be deceived in any way taking this mark of the beast or worshiping the beast. Help us to stay separate, to remove ourselves from not only the city, Mystery Babylon, but even the influence of that city. Help us to stay clean and pure and separate from all of that, and to stand strong. We take encouragement that you've told us, be steadfast, don't be afraid. Even if it means martyrdom, we'll receive a special reward. And but just help us to have courage through all of this, if we are living in the last days. And all of these things, Lord, we pray in your name. Amen.